Well, welcome everybody to the first SCCA Zoom sponsored meeting. We put this together in kind of a hurry for you guys because it's special just for SCCA. This is not one of Association Reserve's normal presentations. So I'm glad we have so many attendees, and I hope we all learned something. Have a great day. Will, take it away.
Okay, yeah, and good morning, everybody. I'm going to turn off my camera in just a few minutes, but I'll just say hello for a second. I want to thanks everyone for joining us. My name is Will Simons. I'll be hosting the presentation today. I want to thank Roger and the whole SCCA for inviting me to put this on. I hope this is really useful information for you. I've taught a couple of education sessions over the years for SCCA. Some of you may already be familiar with me, but a lot of the material I'm going to cover today is content that I've covered before, but now that we're in budget season, I'm going to be going over some of the same things you may have already seen because it's still very relevant information, especially at this time of the year. And there may be some people on the line that are seeing this for the first time. So if you've seen some of this before, just be patient, hang in there. Hopefully it serves as a nice friendly reminder for you, some of these topics. Like I said earlier, I'm going to try to keep this to about 45 minutes or so and then open it up to questions. I've already got a couple of people submitting questions there, which is great. So feel free to use that Q&A feature. I did receive a bunch of questions in advance by email, so I'm probably going to run through those first. But as I said, I'm going to try to stick on the line as long as I can today and get through as much content as time allows. So thank you again. I'll be turning off my camera here in a moment, just so we can focus on the material. Hopefully everybody can see the reserves to the rescue slide up there. Just so you know, this session is being recorded. So after the class today, I'm going to send out a link to a YouTube clip where you'll be able to go back and watch all this again. So feel free to take notes as you're going along, but if you missed something or if you wanted to go back over it again, there will be that opportunity to do so. So without further ado, I'm going to turn off the video and we'll get this going. So before I begin with the presentation, I'd like to just take a moment. I'll introduce myself and our company in a little more detail. As I said, my name is Will Simons. I'm the president of the Florida office for Association Reserves. Been with our company since 2008, and I've spent most of my career in Florida, where we've had clients going back to the early 1990s. If you're not familiar, the RS after my name stands for Reserve Specialist, which is an industry-specific credential that's only awarded to people who have demonstrated their experience and expertise in preparing reserve studies. It's a designation awarded by the Community Associations Institute, or CAI. There's only been, I think, about 350 or so people that have earned the RS credential going back to 1998 when they started handing that out. Personally, I've lived in both condos and HOAs. I've spent about 6 years serving as a treasurer of my own community in South Florida. We had a budget there of over $1 million, about a 635 home HOA. The reason I point that out is because I know what it's like to be on the other side of the table, working with volunteer board members, with committees, people who are taking on the responsibility of managing their associations, which, as we all know, can represent hundreds of people and many millions of dollars worth of property value. So glad you all are here today. I think just about everybody on the line is a board member. So all of the content, all the material today is aimed at you, folks that are coming at this from a volunteer background. So thanks again for joining. Just to give you an overview of our company, we're the oldest and largest reserve study provider in the United States. We've been in the business now since 1986. We've completed tens of thousands of reserve studies for all different types of properties all around the world. We've got offices from coast to coast and more credentialed reserve specialists on staff than any other company. I always like to point out that the majority of the work that we do is for community associations. Probably 90+% of our clients are condos and HOAs like the ones you live in. We also work with timeshares and other types of residential properties, but we also have a good amount of experience with other property types, things like office buildings, hotels, resort properties, churches, schools, you name it. I always point out that our only job as a company is preparing reserve studies. So what I mean by that is we're not an engineering firm or an accounting firm, even though I think the work that we do combines principles of both. but rather we're a specialized consulting firm. We're focused on just doing this one thing really well, which is to guide our clients towards a successful financial future. The way that we do that is by preparing accurate and reliable reserve studies, which help our clients to forecast and budget for major projects. So basically, if we do our job well and our clients are following the plans that we help them design, hopefully they're able to reduce the risk of special assessments and bank loans and other types of financial distress. So if you'd like to get any additional information, our website link is down there at the bottom right. It's just reservestudy.com. We've got a ton of content up there. You can also email me directly, and I'll have my email address up on the screen later in the presentation. But if you want to write that down now, it's wsimons@reservestudy.com. So WSIMONS@reservestudy.com. All right, and this is what I've got for you today. Today's class really just going to have two main sections and then opening up for Q&A. So the first section I think is kind of evergreen. It's always important to touch on this. This is just the philosophy and the reasoning behind why it's important to have reserves at all. In other words, why is it not okay for associations to just pass special assessments and go out and get loans every time they need to take on a big project? After that, we're going to have kind of a timely discussion here, talking about what associations and board members can be doing in the current financial climate, given all the challenges that COVID-19 is causing us these days. So, and then of course we'll have our Q&A portion at the end. So we'll kick it off with our first section here, talking about why should you have reserves at all? And to put this in perspective, I usually kind of ask this as a sort of hypothetical question. If you want to just think about this for a moment, the question is this: what are reserves for? You know, why do associations collect reserves? And put it this way: is it for the here and now, or is it for the future? And again, those that have seen this class live that I've done for you in prior sessions, maybe you're remembering this. I usually have everyone give a show of hands, but maybe just think about your answer for a second. Okay. All right. So when I typically ask this in a live setting, and I think last time I did this for the SCCA, more hands went up for the future, and that's pretty common. But I think it's a pretty critical point to make right off the top that I think it's better to think of reserve funding as being for the here and now. So let me explain that for a moment. We think it's a misunderstanding to think of reserve funding as, you know, saving up for some future project. And the reason why that's not a great approach is because oftentimes there's a very good chance that the current owners that live in an association won't be there by the time some future project takes place. So it seems to make sense to them that they shouldn't be funding reserves towards a project that they won't be around to benefit from. But I want to have you think of it in a different way, okay? Instead, if you think of reserve funding as paying the current bill of deterioration that is occurring now, I think that's maybe a more appropriate way to go about it. Something like a pay-as-you-go model. So if you give you a quick example, let's say that I buy a unit in a brand new condo building, and let's assume that it's got a roof with a 20-year lifespan, okay? Now, if I live there for the first 15 years of that building's existence, that means I'm going to enjoy 15 years worth of use and value out of the roof, not to mention all the other building components, the mechanical systems, the amenities, and so on. Now, let's say I want to sell my unit after those 15 years, and the incoming buyer plans to live there for the next 15 years, okay? But only 5 years after they buy my unit from me, the roof on the building is going to need to be replaced, right? Because we said it's a 20-year roof and 15 plus 5, now the roof's ready to go. This is where it gets tricky. If I had not been charged accordingly during the time that I lived there, meaning I wasn't contributing towards the cost of the roof replacement through reserve funding, you know, I wasn't paying my share of the bill of its deterioration, then the new buyer is going to get stuck with the full cost of the replacement project. And keep in mind, at that point, they will have only lived there for 5 years or 25% of the roof's life, but they'll essentially have to pay for the full 20 years worth of its cost if I'm not paying into reserves. So in other words, they're paying their share of the life of the roof, but also my share, even though I sold my unit and moved away. Okay, so now you're wondering, so what? Well, if you're the second buyer, right, you're the incoming buyer, and you are deciding between associations to buy into. The fact that my association doesn't have a healthy reserve fund, right? They haven't been collecting money from me and all my neighbors, means that you, as the new buyer, are going to be exposed to more cost and certainly a higher chance of a special assessment, which will be needed to make up for all those years during which I was not being charged for my share of that cost, right? And you can imagine how that would have a downward, negative effect on property value. Somebody's not going to want to pay as much for a unit if they're more exposed to costs that they weren't around to benefit from the use of those assets. Okay, in our business, we talk about these 4 kind of reserve rules. First of which is that reserve expenses are inevitable. Okay, there's no getting around the fact that air conditioning systems need to be replaced, elevators need to be modernized, roads need to be repaved. All of those things are just a fact of life. Number 2, the board is responsible. Okay, you guys as board members out there, you're the ones that are entrusted with managing the community association on behalf of all your owners. Next up, when projects get delayed, they tend to get more expensive. And we see this all the time, particularly in the case of things like roofs and concrete restoration and other types of building exterior, building envelope components, right? The longer you let something go, the more damage sinks in and the more expensive it's going to be to fix that. Now, lastly, very important thing to keep in mind, the homeowners are the ones that will always get stuck paying the bill. Right? There's no Uncle Sam. We have no government bailouts coming for community associations that don't have adequate reserve funds. All right. And just like there are 4 rules for those types of expenses, there's only 4 options for how to pay the bills. The first and best option, of course, is to have that healthy reserve fund. Right? You chip away at it, you assess your owners on an ongoing basis, and you accumulate funding over time. That's far and away the best, most effective way to do this. The second best option is to pass special assessments when those projects come along. Now, should be obvious, I always kind of make the joke that it's a bad situation when the second best option on the table has this skull and crossbones warning on it. And I'm sure a lot of you out there have gone through times when your associations have had to pass those special assessments. So you know what I mean by that. It's a toxic thing for a community to go through. The next best option would be to take out a loan or a line of credit if you need to pay for a project. The reason I have that one ranked after a special assessment is because, of course, the cost of the project will be greater due to the cost of the financing involved. And then what happens if you don't do any of those 3? Well, then your only choice is to just kind of let the property fall into disrepair. In other words, if you don't pay any money out of pocket up front to take care of it, you're not special assessing, you're not getting loans, the property's still going to fall apart physically. And in that case, you're just going to end up suffering a decline in your actual property value. All right, these are some of the specific benefits of having reserve funds. Hopefully I don't have to convince you all too much why reserves are needed, but let's just talk through these. Starting at the top, hopefully you won't have any surprises, or at least a lower chance of getting caught by surprise. What we mean is that if you're funding reserves and you're paying attention, then typically you'll be tracking the remaining life expectancies of all your components. And when you do that, that should give you the option to plan ahead and prepare for when things need to be replaced, rather than reacting and getting caught by surprise when something fails unexpectedly. When you're planning ahead, that also gives you the chance to shop around and select from different providers, right? Now, having time on your side, that gives you the ability to get more bids, write up a more specific scope of work, maybe use a consultant to help with that process. But ultimately, that might translate into minimizing your costs by streamlining the process and taking advantage of the best opportunities you can to work with good contractors. For example, if you talk to a painting company and you find out that there's some advantageous time of the year to work with them, maybe they have a slow season when costs are a little lower, that would certainly work out in your favor. On the flip side, if you're calling out to those same contractors on an emergency basis because, let's say your cooling tower just failed and it's 4th of July weekend, well, now you're going to get stuck paying a much higher fee because it's a rushed project. It's an emergency at that point. The point here about minimizing exposure, that's mostly relevant to you board members. What I mean by that is that if you are proactively taking care of your property, you're doing a better job of upholding your fiduciary duty. That will give you better protection against any potential complaints or lawsuits that may come from your owners. The last point I want to make here is that if you're doing all of those things, that should naturally lead to increasing property values. In our experience, the communities that are doing a good job of reserve funding tend to have better curb appeal. They're more up to date with respect to technology, more modern amenities than the ones that don't. All of that contributes to a better ownership experience for the people who live there now, but also that would make them more attractive to those potential buyers. So that's a common refrain I come back to, is just thinking of your community from the perspective of somebody who wants to buy into it, not necessarily always from the people who have lived there for a couple of decades who maybe you're a little bit more complacent. Okay, all the opposites are true if you don't have a healthy reserve fund. Of course, that means you're more exposed to surprises. That can lead to higher expenses, more liability exposure, ultimately declining property values. The real problem we see here is that when communities fall into this kind of vicious cycle, this pattern, it becomes more and more difficult to break out of it as time goes on. Now, I don't want to go off the rails too much here, and I'm not an attorney, so this isn't my field, but one of the particular arguments that comes up here with respect to liability exposure is the business judgment rule. Now, some of you may be familiar with that. It basically is a kind of legal principle that applies to directors of any sort of not-for-profit corporation or for-profit corporation for that matter. Basically means you have a moral and ethical and legal obligation to represent the owners in your community. Or your corporation in that case. And if you're not doing that, if it can be proven that you were, breaching that trust, breaching that fiduciary duty, then most insurance companies, if not all, from what I understand, will not protect you from a D&O coverage. Your directors and officers coverage will not protect you from individual liability if you are breaching that business judgment rule and not upholding that fiduciary duty. So again, that's not my field specifically. If you have any particular questions about that and you're worried about anything in that regard, I would talk to your association's attorney just to make sure you're handling everything by the book, because there have been a few cases where board members get into lawsuits on an individual basis, and even though it's a thankless job, and trust me, I know that, even though you're not getting paid, it's you're spending a lot of time doing it. There is some risk on the table for board members if you're not going about things the right way. So I'll leave it at that. Gonna have two more slides on this kind of opening section here. And by the way, a lot of this, the backdrop for some of this material, particularly this slide here where I get into talking about percent funded, these are things that I cover in much more detail in some other classes that we teach. So perhaps what I'll do when I send out the follow-up email is give you links to two other courses. You'll see a lot of the same slides there, but we have a much more in-depth explanation of percent funded, and we have a whole class that's really devoted to the subject of straight line versus pooled funding. There were several people that asked questions about that, and we'll get to that. But if you wanted to get a deeper dive on those topics, I do have separate hour-long classes on each of those that I think you might find interesting. So, but for those that might have seen my prior courses before or are familiar with the concept of percent funded, what you're looking at on this chart here, this is the result of a very large internal analysis that we completed a number of years ago. In this case, we looked at a data set of thousands of associations, and we measured for two variables. First, what was their percent funded level, which if you're familiar with the concept, that's a way to measure the relative strength of an association's reserve fund at a fixed point in time. And then the second variable, did we, yes or no, include a special assessment as part of their funding plan? In other words, was that community in such dire straits that they needed an immediate shot in the arm, an immediate special assessment just to kind of get them up off the ground? And what we found, the results were pretty obvious and in line with what we expected to find. Basically, the closer an association is to 0% funded, the weaker their cash position, the higher the chances that they need some immediate special assessment as part of their plan going forward, right? Makes perfect sense. If you're If you've got major projects coming up in the near future and you haven't been accumulating funds to get ready for those things, then a special assessment is the natural, conclusion of that. It's a form of a catch-up contribution that brings the account current to kind of make up for all the lost time when associations weren't budgeting enough in prior years. Okay, a few years later, we did another internal study, and again, keep in mind that the whole argument here is why have reserves? Well, this is one where it really, really affects the bottom line. This time around, we wanted to see if there was any correlation between percent funded for an association and the actual property values of the homes within those communities. So the way we did this one was we looked at a very large data set, again, a couple hundred properties in this case, from one metropolitan area as a part of Southern California near our home office, our headquarters office. What we did was to select a group of properties that were all as similar as they could be in terms of size and age and amenities and so on, try to get as many close comps as we could. We then measured the market value of the homes in those communities, and we wanted to see what difference it made when the associations themselves were in a better financial position. So to be specific, what we wanted to know was, is there any sort of increase in property value we see when an association is in a better financial position as measured by percent funded? So the first thing we did was we set a baseline, right? And that would be defined as the associations that are kind of over here in this weak position, anything from 0 to 30% funded. We then looked at what happened to property values when those, again, the same types of associations were in a fair position between 30 and 70%. And again, keep in mind, everything else was as equal as possible. What we found was that the units in the fair position communities were about 8% higher, 8% more valuable than the ones in the weak associations. Now, even more interesting, once you got into a strong position above 70% funded, we saw a gain of almost 13%. Okay, so you can kind of see how that might be the case. If, again, everything else being equal, the communities that have money in the bank tend to get things done on time. They have better curb appeal. They have a fresh coat of paint. Their gym equipment is brand new. Those are all the ones that are more attractive to potential buyers, right? Which comes back to supply and demand, which kind of helps answer that question. Why have reserves? Well, one of the arguments is that overall, compared to other comparable communities, if your association has reserve money in the bank, that can actually be measured to have a double-digit increase in your actual home values. So for those owners out there that are kind of obstinate, that are against this whole concept, these are real-world numbers that we've been able to measure for ourselves. All right, so I'm going to switch gears now, and this is kind of what Roger and I had talked about as being kind of the heart of the class today. Want to talk briefly kind of about the current state of affairs in this country and how these things might affect community associations. Obviously, I don't have to tell you that nobody has all the answers right now, and there's certainly a lot of uncertainty about how this will ultimately affect our economy overall, and certainly at the micro level for community associations. But to try and shed some light on things and just give our company's perspective, we put together an ebook earlier this year. I'll be sending that out to everybody on the call after the presentation today. It's just a PDF file, so you can look forward to that. But prior to that, I thought it might be a good idea just to give you a broad overview of some of the material that we include in the book, which is called Reserves to the Rescue. So look forward to that, but I'm going to give you kind of a short book report, if you will, just leading up to that. So, all right, first and foremost, we got to keep in mind that there's a certain physical reality to the elements of a community association. So no matter what's happening in the overall economy, or for that matter, what's happening at the individual association level in terms of financial distress, again, reserve expenses aren't going away. I talked about this earlier. Those expenses are inevitable. They will be happening regardless of who's paying their bills on time or whether or not there's still a pandemic going on, anything else in the outside world, right? Sometimes I'll joke that the roof on a building has no idea who's living under it or how much money is in anyone's bank account. That roof is just sitting there in the sun, deteriorating every day, getting closer and closer to its replacement date. So, there is a certain objective reality that I want you to keep in mind. Now, if you look at the headlines these days, I think you'll see a lot of what I call here FUD, or FUD, also known as fear, uncertainty, and doubt. And in the association world, I think that that means specifically the fear that people may be out of work or otherwise unable or unwilling to pay their assessments to their associations. That would mean that there's a smaller number of people who then have to shoulder the burden of the association's finances, while it may also be trying to collect on bad debt. Okay, we certainly saw an extreme example of that happening after 2008, 2009, when we had the down economy and a severe housing crisis. Lots of people upside down on their mortgages and literally walking away from their communities, leaving those associations holding the bag. So far, the housing market seems to be pretty stable, and from what we've seen, what we've heard, associations aren't having a terrible time with this financially. But if this whole thing keeps going for much longer, if the economy takes a greater downturn, if the stock market crashes, that could eventually be the case. I've sat in on several webinars over the last couple of months listening to owners of management companies and law firms talking about their experience with this. So far, what I've come to find, and it's, I haven't gotten the latest numbers, but just kind of, anecdotally, the delinquencies, the accounts receivable for associations don't seem to have increased a whole lot. From what we can tell, it seems as though most people are still paying their bills on time, which is great. Hopefully it stays that way. But the bottom line here is that, it may be very easy to get carried away by the headlines and to use those as an excuse for what we may look back on as poor financial decision making. And one of our goals in creating this book and in putting on this class for you today is to try to help you all avoid that. So rather than get caught up in that FUD, that fear, uncertainty, and doubt, we want to help you focus on what you can control, right? Again, it's easy to get lost in the headlines, and don't get me wrong, we should all be paying attention to what's happening in the world out there, but at the same time, I think it's very important to focus on what you can control, and that's going to be what happens within your own community, right? So if you're on the board, remember, you have that fiduciary duty to the owners to run that community to the best of your abilities. That means you have to communicate responsibly and fully about the reality of the situation that we're in. So if you do have, rising delinquencies, if you've got, some other concerns that are brought about by the current climate, be transparent about that, but also, keep two hands on the wheel, right? It is literally your job, your responsibility to try to steer your community into the light, towards a successful future. So one way that we've been, putting that out there is to say that, you want to think globally, but act locally, act within your communities, work with your teams, work with your property managers, and do the best that you can to get through this. Okay, so kind of getting into the material of the book, how do we go about doing that? Well, we've come up with 3, I would say, broad strategies that community associations can put in place if you're having a bad time with this, if you're stressed out, if your financial picture is looking more challenging than normal. Hopefully these ideas will help you to navigate through this and get out the other side. There's obviously a lot more detail in the book, and I'll leave it up to you all to read that through. It's only about 20 pages or so, and a lot of those are filled with graphics and charts and tables and things like that. But I want to just give you some of the key points today. So the first one is that we can take a careful look at our expenditures, particularly those reserve expenditures, and see if there's any place in there that you might be able to delay or defer spending, especially for items that maybe are not as important to the overall operation of the community. Okay, you might think of things in terms of these sorts of classifications where you look at each part and piece and system within your property, right? Every asset on your reserve schedule, and sort of categorize it, define its value to the community in some format like this, where you can determine, is this thing trivial, is it inconsequential, or is it absolutely critical to the operation of our community? Just quick examples, if you have something like the hot water heater in your pool bathroom building, if that breaks down, so what? No big deal. All that means is that if people are using the bathroom, they're going to wash their hands with cold water instead of hot. Not a high priority. On the other end of the spectrum, you might have something like an elevator, right? A cooling tower, where the operation of that system is absolutely critical to everyday life within your building, within your property. So as you're looking forward, you're looking at the next several years of expenses in your reserve schedule. You can see which ones are getting close to zero in terms of their lifespan. And if there are things in the plan that are on this side of the spectrum that are closer to the inconsequential, trivial, wish list type stuff, you can probably think smart about deferring or delaying some of those things, or not doing them at all, right? Something like a hallway renovation, a lobby project, things that, if you put them off by a couple years, that's really not going to hurt anybody. Those are opportunities where you might be able to improve your financial picture by increasing the life expectancy in your schedule, by extending those out. That will reduce the amount of reserve contributions you need to put in the bank for those things. Now, obviously, there's a flip side here. On the other hand, if you've got a key mechanical system, a security system, the roof on your building, that begs the question, what is life going to be like if this thing broke and we don't have the money to fix it? How will that affect our owners? And then obviously you want to consider those as your priorities when you're planning out for the next several years. Another strategy we talk about in the book here is to quote unquote borrow from reserves. Okay. Now, this is a potentially tricky situation, and I think it's fair to say that this should be thought of as somewhat of a last resort, but we'll talk about this in a moment. There's actually a couple of different ways you can go about borrowing from reserves. I want to make a couple of important points. Some of these are things that people asked about in the questions leading up to today. First of all, it is permissible, it is legal, it's allowable for an association to use reserve money for non-reserve purposes, as long as you get the approval of the owners to do that. Okay, it's considered the term they use is a non-scheduled use of reserve funds. And anytime you're going to do that, that requires the majority vote of the owners. So just as a quick example, that it's the same process where if you want to use money that's in a straight line reserve roof account for a painting project or swimming pool project, you can do that, but it's up to the owners to approve you moving funds from one place to another. But the trick here is that you can actually use reserve money for non-reserve purposes by the same function, right? If you get that vote of approval, that money can be unlocked and used for other purposes. That could just be adding a cushion to your operating account if you're worried about bad debt, or if you have if we have a big storm, you have an insurance deductible you need to pay, some other kind of emergency situation. Your reserve money is there for you. You can borrow from it, and from a legal standpoint, there's actually no specific requirement to pay that money back to reserves. Okay, if you vote to move it out of reserves and use it on something else, there is no legal mandate that tells you have to put it back, but absolutely something that you should do, because remember, that money was there for a specific purpose. And if you're borrowing from it to pay for that unscheduled, that unintended purpose, that doesn't magically remove the obligation to pay for its intended purpose, right? If you had it there for a swimming pool resurfacing project, you can certainly argue that resurfacing the pool is not as high a priority as, a more immediate need, but it eventually is still going to need to be done, okay? So you want to have some kind of plan in place to put that money back at some point, and ideally as quickly as possible. So if you're thinking about borrowing from reserves, if your association's in a pinch and this might be a strategy for you, I think maybe a better approach, or it could be a hybrid approach between reserves and something like a credit line. That way you're leaving more cash where it is, leaving the money in reserves, and using a line of credit, or just focusing on your borrowing power to cover your short-term needs. That's a very common question we get about insurance deductibles. So a lot of communities ask if you can actively fund reserves for paying insurance deductible, and legally speaking, you can. But because it's a surprise, because it has an undefined timeline for when it'll need to be done, I would usually say that, go out in advance, get yourself a line of credit that's at least enough to cover that deductible. Leave your cash where it is as much as you possibly can. But it is possible to do that. All right, so when I talk about borrowing from reserves, I want to make it clear this can actually happen in a couple of different ways. So one way, the one here in red, that's the most literal definition, where you actually take money out of your reserve account and move it into your operating funds. To me, I think that's, again, maybe the least preferable of the options on the table, something we talked about on the last slide. Again, it can be done, but maybe not the best idea. But, kind of frame it this way. Keep in mind, reserve contributions are just one part of your overall annual budget. So that means there's some other flexible ways you can go about doing this without actually taking cash out of operating. So let's say that you're going to keep your budget the same, meaning the owners are still writing the same check each month, but you can temporarily stop reserve funding. Okay, so you might say, okay, and next year we're going to stop our reserves. We're not going to bring our budget down. Everybody's going to write the same, $400, $500 a month check, whatever it is, to our association. But instead of parking money over in reserves, we're going to free up some of that money and use it on the operating side. If we're anticipating that more people are going to be delinquent, we're going to have more bad debt, having a little more cash, a little more cushion on the operating side might help you get through that. If you just kind of think about this on the individual level, right? If you're worried about paying a big bill in the next couple of months, one way you can go about that is maybe temporarily stop contributing to your 401k account. Okay, because there's a more immediate need for that money. If you need a new transmission for your car, or your kid just broke their arm and you've got to pay their hospital bills, that's a more pressing concern than funding for retirement. Obviously, it doesn't mean that funding for retirement is not important, just that it's not the most important thing right now, and that maybe that money may be better used for something else in the short term. Okay, now again, keep in mind that that may require a catch-up contribution, an accelerated amount of saving down the road, but you've got to deal with your priorities as they come along. So again, just as another option, instead of stopping reserve funding entirely, maybe you just reduce your contributions. You keep your budget at its current level, but instead of putting quite so much into reserves, you take a little chunk of that money, you free it up and putting into the operating budget for that next year. Okay, the last big point here that I want to make is to try to take advantage of the situation. What I mean here is that, maybe there is an opportunity here to cut your expenses a little bit, right? We know there are two ways to improve the cash flow for any business. And keep in mind that your community association is a business. It's a not-for-profit corporation. So the two ways obviously are to increase revenues, meaning higher assessments, or to cut costs. Now, increasing revenues in an association means raising assessments, and that's certainly not something people are ever happy about, and especially in an uncertain economy. So the other way to do it is to maybe try to improve that cash flow by cutting your cost. And in this case, maybe that's renegotiating contracts. Okay, it could mean cutting down on non-essential services. Could mean that requires some difficult conversations with some of your vendors. I don't want to paint too grim a portrait here, but there are certainly some businesses out there that are going to have a harder time with this situation than others. So, quick example, if your business is in gym equipment service and maintenance, and people haven't been using their gyms because they've had to shut them down for COVID, maybe there's just no need for cleaning and servicing the equipment. So your revenues as a business may be way down. Now, if you have a contract with a company like that, maybe they'll be a little bit more agreeable to working with you on a new pricing structure going forward, right? They're just at this point trying to keep the lights on, trying to stay afloat, and we don't want to be mean-spirited, but again, your obligation is to the association, and if there's a way you can try to improve the financial picture by working with vendors in some of these ways, then I think that's worth looking into. A lot of the vendors that we interface with in our business are considered essential businesses. So, anybody in the construction world hopefully hasn't had as bad a time with this, but no matter what your business is, I think most everybody is at least a little bit on edge. So, if you as an association are getting bids for a big project that you have coming up in the near future, it may not hurt to ask the vendor if there's any opportunities for discounts. If there, another way is, like I mentioned earlier, is there some advantageous time of the year where you might get a better price? See if they have a slow season that you can take advantage of. I can only speak for our company, but just as a quick example, we have a very distinct busy season, which is basically right now. As I'm sure you know, everybody's working on their budgets. So pretty much the whole reserve study world is very, very busy right now. It's something like what accountants face each year. right? We have these specific financial deadlines where we have a huge amount of clients that are all trying to do the same thing at the same time, which means, right now our phones are ringing off the hook. I'm not really able to do anybody any favors because everybody's on a deadline. There's no reason that we couldn't have done these reserve studies much earlier in the year, though. We have a very slow season, I would say, in the first quarter of each year, where we can typically offer a much more attractive price. So, that's just a quick example, but, think of that as you operate within your communities. If you think there might be a better time of the year to work with a certain vendor, that can be a tree trimming project, that can be, really, anything. It's at least worth asking the question. So in the interest of time, I'm looking at the clock here. I want to leave it at that for now. Certainly encourage everybody to download, to check out that ebook. We'll be sending that out after the class. Certainly a lot more detailed information, specific examples in there of how you might be able to save money. We have some really interesting illustrations of what happens to a budget when you defer some of those expenses, for example, all in the spirit of trying to help keep your associations going through this crisis. Again, nobody knows how long, how severe this ultimately might be. But just as a reminder to keep taking the long view, keep in mind that your obligations rather are as a community, as a board member, they're going to be the same no matter what happens in the overall economy. But hopefully these are some tools that might give you some helpful ideas here to try to make this process, as smooth as possible. So we'll be sending that out shortly. For now, I'm going to switch gears. We'll go into the Q&A. Again, here's my email address. So if there's something that you wanted to ask about that we don't get through today, take down this email address and be happy to try to get through those. So I do have a number of questions that were submitted in advance. I've already loaded those up onto the slides here. I've got a couple more that have come in on the Q&A feature. So I'm going to run through the slides first, and then we'll get through as many as we can. So feel free to hang on the line as long as possible. I'm going to do my best to stay on for at least another 20 minutes or so, and we'll see how quick we get through these. So the first one up here, can we include contingencies in reserve schedules? The legal technical answer is yes, but the practical answer is you shouldn't. I have a whole class on the subject where we talk about what defines a reserve component. How do you actually figure out what goes on a reserve schedule? And one of the criteria is that the component in question has to have a predictable timeline. It has to have a predictable life expectancy and cost. And a contingency is the opposite of that. It's just a safety net. So I would always say that contingencies are a good idea for the operating budget. If you're worried that, you want to just park an extra $10,000 or $20,000 for, whatever surprises come your way, that's not a bad idea, whether that's in the form of cash contributions or a credit line. But I wouldn't muddy the waters with your reserve schedule. You want to limit that very carefully to the things that do have predictable timelines. So, it's possible, but not advisable to do contingencies that way. Okay, this question was framed as, coming in from the operating budget, what criteria should be in place to determine when a new line, as separated from an existing line, should be added to the budget for tracking? It's a good question here. So, the example that came to mind for me was when I was a board member, we had a routine landscaping amount in our budget. We also had a tree trimming amount and a mulch amount, because the tree trimming and the mulch spreading, those only happen once a year. And so it was kind of, it would throw off our monthly accounting when we saw, our routine monthly landscaping bill would jump all of a sudden in the months when we had tree trimming and mulch work to do. So because those were kind of these singular instances that only happen once, we thought it might be best from a tracking standpoint to give them their own line item. At the end of the day, it kind of doesn't matter as long as the dollar amounts are correct or as close to reality as possible. But I think that's one way to make that call. If you break something out or leave it combined, is the timing of the expense. If it's something that happens on a routine weekly basis, then that's pretty easy to encapsulate as its own line item. If it's a one-off project that only happens once a year, I think that maybe deserves its own treatment there. Second question, kind of the opposite. What criteria should be used to determine when a budget line should be suppressed and combined with another existing budget line? So it's kind of the reverse. If you have a miscellaneous repairs line item, maybe that is more all-encompassing than if you try to itemize and say, plumbing repairs, electrical repairs, air conditioning repairs. That's another thing we did when I was a board member, is we looked at all these various kind of miscellaneous physical repair allowances that we were trying to track, and we said, look, these are random. We don't know when they're going to come up. We have a fairly good idea looking at historical costs of what our total annual spend is going to be, but we're not sure when during the year they're going to happen. And it was just kind of trying to put too fine a point on it to track each one individually. So it's kind of a tough call. Yeah, I'm sure every individual case is going to be unique here. I would certainly talk to your CPA, talk to your bookkeeper, talk to your manager, see if they have any insights maybe they've learned from other communities that might help this out. Okay, next question, kind of this one's framed as in the reserve budget. Describe examples of getting reserve categories segregated so that the analysis is at the replaceable unit level. For example, a pool category probably needs to be reduced to motors, and all the other various parts and pieces. So on the reserve side of things, it's actually more simple. When we look at a pool area, okay, to me, that is 6 or 8 individual components, not just one broad category. You've got pool furniture, you've got the pool deck, you've got the fence, you've got the heaters, you got the filters, you have the interior surface itself. Each one of those has its own distinct useful life expectancy. So that's really the determining factor. If the various components within a category have differing timelines, then as much as possible, you want to break those down into those individual timelines so you track each expense as separate from the rest. Not everything in a pool area goes bad at the same time and needs to be replaced. So if you just have a very broad category and call it pool and give it a 10-year useful life, well, there's certain things that might only last 3 years there. If you've got a gas heater on a beachfront property, that's, you'll be lucky to get 3 or 4 years out of that thing. But if you're designing your budget assuming this sort of average useful life of everything there, you're going to be too short on certain things, too long on others. So, you don't want to break it down to, the very, very small level, talking about, $200 items. But, to the extent these are individually significant costs, I would say the determining factor is whether or not they have a different lifespan. Something like a swimming pool and a jacuzzi, if they have the same type of surface and they're going to be resurfaced every 10 or 12 years at the same time, then in that case, maybe it's fair to combine those into one component, just say pool and spa resurfacing. But that's kind of the way we would think through that. The second question here, describe the advantages of pooled reserves versus straight line reserves when an association is fully funding or partially funding. So again, I have a whole nother class on this subject, and I kind of don't pull any punches in saying that pooled reserves are definitely more advantageous than straight line for a couple reasons. One, it's a more effective, more efficient way to fund reserves. It costs less money out of pocket to the owners typically to use the pooled method than the straight line method. The reason is that in the straight line method, your funds are locked up in these various categories. In the class I teach, I call them buckets. You have all these separate buckets, and to move money from one place to another, again, requires the vote of the owners to do that. When you pool your reserves, the analogy is that you're dumping all those buckets into one big bathtub, and it's a more efficient distribution of all the available cash. Once you've pooled your reserves, you can spend the money on everything or anything on the list whenever necessary. It's not segregated into those various line items. So I would certainly just, across the board, and I think I speak for the whole industry really, that pooling is the way to go. Outside of Florida, it's not even a question. Florida is the only state in the country I'm aware of where a lot of associations still use the straight line method. Now, to the point about fully funding or partially funding, that's kind of the same answer whether or not you are pooled or not. Full funding means you have a lower risk of special assessments. But, that's just the bottom line. If you're partially funding your reserves, that's better than nothing, but that means you're running a higher risk that you're going to have these big catch-up contributions. If you're only funding something at half speed and it's getting closer and closer to its replacement date, eventually you're going to have to make up for that. And usually that's in the form of a special assessment or a loan. So, I think you should always try to go for full funding, fund as high as you can. But one advantage of pooling the reserves is that the full funding requirement will typically be a lower dollar amount than it will be in straight line. And again, I wouldn't highly recommend that the other class that we teach to get a full breakdown on that. Okay, here the question is, operating expenses cannot be paid by reserve dollars. Can reserve expenses be paid by operating if you have a excess? Yes, you can. So operating money is unrestricted. That means you can spend it on anything you need. And if you have a situation where you've got a surplus in your operating budget, you can certainly free up some of that money and contribute it towards reserves, or pay the difference on a reserve project. So there's different rules of thumb about how much you should keep in your operating account. I've heard as low as 2 to 3 months worth of expenses. On the conservative side, I've heard people say 6 months worth of operating expenses that you should keep in your operating budget. But if you have more than that, or whatever your comfort level is, yeah, absolutely, you can use those operating dollars to pay for a reserve expense. That's totally easy to do. There's no hoops to jump through there. It's only when you go the other way, again, when you want to borrow money from reserves, that's more complicated. That's when you have to get the owners to approve that because it was not its intended purpose. Okay, why are more and more associations changing over to pooled reserves, and how do you convince your members to do the same? I don't want to keep plugging this this class that I have, but I do about 30 minutes on that very subject. I mean, the bullet points are that again, pooling is more efficient, it's more effective, and I think it's more realistic. One of the advantages of the pooled method is that it gives you a long-term perspective. The other term for the pooled method is called the cash flow method, which means that you're modeling out the next 20 to 30 years of cash flow and setting an objective for your financial position over time. So you can take advantage of interest earnings, as opposed to in the straight line method, you're just looking at one fiscal year at a time. There's no way to really model in the gains you'll get from interest invested in your reserves. So, I'll kind of leave it at that. I mean, it's every attorney I speak to, every CPA, every other reserve study company, we're all pretty much unanimous that the pooled method is the way to go. I call the straight line method the old-fashioned method. It was the only method you could use in Florida up until 2002. After that, we've seen more and more associations changing over to pooled and never looking back. It's an easier thing to manage from an administrative standpoint. A lot of the headache with the straight line method comes from that issue of borrowing from one account to pay for another and having to get the majority vote of the owners. I'm sure you guys know it's very difficult to get any sort of quorum for anything, so to get the majority vote to do anything in a community is very, very difficult. So in practice, even if you want to move money from one place to another, from painting to roofing, for example, it's not a very easy thing to do. So, there's a lot more literature on the topic. We've got the class that we teach on the subject, and I'll be happy to send out that link. But, I guess the bottom line is that when we do a side-by-side analysis for the same community and we portray their reserves in their current straight line method, and then we show them this is what it would be if you pooled the reserves, usually the pooled amount is dramatically less because it's just, again, a more efficient distribution of all your available cash. Okay, let's see. Can accrued reserves that were identified for specific long-term issues be used for annual operating problems, which would normally be assessed for? How is that done, if even legal? So kind of talked about during the class, you can borrow from reserves. That money is yours, you can use it, but everybody needs to understand that when you put it into the reserve account, it was done with reason. It was done for a specific purpose. And if you want to use it for something other than that, then the owners have to vote to approve it. So it is legal. It does require a vote. And like I mentioned earlier, it does not have to be paid back from a legal standpoint, but absolutely it should, because again, remember, it was there for a reason, and that reason's not going away. You know, by taking money out of your tennis court account, that doesn't magically erase your tennis court from the property. It's still there. It'll still need to be taken care of, and that's what you need that money for. Okay, now I had a series of questions, all from the same person. I'm going to try to capture these all at once, or at least kind of in a sequence here. Did the reserve items need to be for specific maintenance items? Yes, they do. So when you put together a reserve schedule, you have to clearly define what each component is. You have to give it a useful life, a remaining useful life, and a cost estimate. So to just put a line item in there for deferred maintenance is too ambiguous. It's too undefined, because, you know, what does that mean? What is the useful life for deferred maintenance? Well, it totally depends on the actual underlying components. So you want to be specific and define that category, define that list as carefully as you can. May the reserve items be for items less than $10,000? Yes. So practically speaking, it's pretty common that we'll do a reserve study and include things on the list that may only be $1,500, you know, $2,000. The idea is to try to capture as much as we can in reserves, which reduces the burden on the operating budget, which would otherwise be the only place to pay for them. So, you know, imagine a situation where you've got 6 projects that are $5,000 each. Well, you would be okay from a legal standpoint to not reserve for those, because the condo statute 718 requires that you fund for things that are $10,000 or more. But if you're ignoring those things, that, you know, 6 projects, $5,000 each, that's $30,000, right? If you're not reserving for those, you're assuming that your operating budget will be able to pick up the tab, that it will be able to absorb those costs when they come along. And, you know, if you're running a tight budget and you get hit with a $30,000, you know, quote unquote surprise, that might, you know, derail you a little bit. So our thought is that, you know, pick a number that is financially significant to your community. You know, if you've got hundreds and hundreds of owners, you know, maybe $5,000 is still a drop in the bucket. But if you have a 20-unit building, you know, it's very appropriate to think of things less than $10,000 as reserve items. When pooled, what determines which line monies can be transferred from one to another? I'm just going to say off the top that when you have a pooled reserve setup, there is no transferring of money from one place to another. It's, you know, it's one pooled reserve account which can be spent on anything on the list. So there is no need to move money from one place to another in that point. I'm not sure if that's exactly what the question is meant to be asking here, but I think that's the overall point I want to make, is that that's another one of the advantages of the pooled method, is that there is no more hoops to jump through in terms of moving money around. It's all just there and available for anything on your reserve schedule. Okay, again, when pooled, if monies are transferred, does it have to be transferred back at an accelerated rate? Again, there's no, you've removed the labels in this case. There's no such thing as a roof reserve dollar versus an elevator reserve dollar. So there isn't really any transferring of money at that point. If you're talking about moving money from operating to reserves, you know, the initial funding of the account, that's a different story. But it's not, you know, it's not any more complicated than that. And when pooled, is it required for each item be tracked on a specific line? Yes, you're still going to be I guess when I say tracked, you're still going to be looking at the individual life expectancies of your components, their individual replacement costs, because collectively they determine how big the pool needs to be, right? So you may have 30 things on your pooled reserve schedule, but at any point in time, what we're doing is looking at the fraction of life that has expired for that individual component and its replacement cost, and that gives us a number called the fully funded balance for that component. So just as a quick example, let's say you've got some asset, some piece of equipment that's going to cost you $10,000 and has a 10-year life expectancy. On average, what that means is every year you're going to put aside $1,000 for that eventual replacement 10 years from now. You can stop at some point along the way, let's say after 4 years, and ask yourself, well, how much money should we have today? And of course, the answer would be $4,000, because 4 years at $1,000 a year means that you theoretically should have accumulated $4,000 at that point. So when you're calculating how much money should be in your pool of funds, you would look at that specific line item, say, okay, if we broke this into like a big pie chart, out of our overall pool of funds, about $4,000 needs to be going towards this thing as of now. And you can do that for everything on the list. And when you add all those theoretical numbers together, you arrive at the total, what we call the fully funded balance, that theoretical number that the association should have. So again, when you're pooling, you're still tracking things on an individual basis, because that determines how big the pool needs to be at a certain point in time. I guess that's the most concise way to say it. When you're pooled, what criteria which determines which GL and expense comes from should be this defined in a separate board document. When you're talking about board documents, now we're veering over into legal territory. So if you have a resolution, if you have an amendment in your documents that specifies how you're actually spending money, that may be in conjunction with what's required by statutes, and for that I would say talk to your attorney, because board documents that may affect how things are done are kind of handled on a case-by-case basis. So that's something I would kind of defer to an attorney there. Okay, let's see. In addition to high dollar maintenance items, may reserve lines be set for capital improvements? Now I'm going to give my definition of a capital improvement, which is, to me, a capital improvement is something that doesn't currently exist at the property. So the classic example I always give is a playground. Let's say you've got a condo building with a empty lot, and you want to build a playground there. That would be considered a capital improvement, because it's not something that currently exists. Even though it may be a good idea to put one in, and it would be a good thing for the community, you can't use reserve money for that. You can't save up for some future project that you want to add. Now, once the playground in this case is built, then you would start reserving for its eventual repair and replacement, and changing out the equipment and the swing sets and the fall surface and all that kind of stuff. But if that's what you mean by a capital improvement, then you can't use reserve money for that. Reserves are very specifically for the things that already exist, and for which you need to save up for their repair and replacement. The next question, are building interior remodels typically considered capital improvements or building maintenance? To me, I would say that those are, again, using the same definition we just established, to me that's building maintenance, in the sense that they are predictable, they are recurring. There's obviously more subjectivity as to how often you do something like a lobby remodel as opposed to a roof replacement. There's more room for interpretation there as to what the life expectancy should be, what an appropriate cost for that project should be. But I still say that they are appropriate and predictable to list in the reserve schedule. We're not talking about something that doesn't already exist. They do exist, and taste change. You want to think of it in terms of curb appeal. How often do you need to remodel, renovate your hallways, renovate your social room, your card rooms? Those are all definitely important and should be treated as amenities of the association, just like a pool or a tennis court. Just because they're inside the building, maybe that gives you some more flexibility in terms of when you need to do it, because there's not the same physical exposure to the elements that would kind of trigger a certain project happening at a certain time. But yeah, to me, those are still classically reserve expenses. There were some other questions that came through that were talking about, board documents and meeting minutes and how to record things, how to prove that, that an association has switched to the pooled method. Those are all great questions. I just don't have the answers for them. Some of those were more kind of legal in nature. So again, very, very astute questions, but something that you'd probably want to get an attorney's opinion for, because unfortunately, that's just not my realm in terms of dealing with documents and what's required and that sort of thing. So, okay, so that was the end of the questions that we had in advance. I'm going to take a look now at the ones that were coming through live during the session, and we'll get through these as quick as we can as well. So the first question here, would you recommend having a line item in the operating budget for contingencies for truly unforeseen items like COVID? If so, how much should this be? So again, I do think that the operating budget is the right place to have contingencies, first and foremost. Let me turn my camera back on for you guys now. And we'll stop our screen share just so I can talk to you somewhat directly. So would you recommend having a line item in operating for contingencies for unforeseen items? Yes, I think that's reasonable to have. Something like COVID, I don't think anybody could have seen that coming. If you did have a very broadly defined contingency and that's serving you well, kudos, good planning. Of course, the downside is that if you're including a contingency and nothing comes to pass, then you could argue that you're overcharging the owners. You're collecting money for things that you're never actually going to spend. So I do think an operating contingency is smart in terms of how much you should budget there. That's a tough one to answer. I might say, figure a month worth of expenses just would be a random way to go about it. If you assume that the worst case scenario happens and nobody's going to pay their dues for a month, nobody in the association, that's a pretty conservative way to go about it. I think that's highly unlikely, but you could sort of talk your way into it, as opposed to just picking an arbitrary dollar amount, looking at it as a percentage of your expenses and trying to come up with some reasonable cushion there. In personal finance, they always say you should have, up to 6 months worth of your home expenses parked in a savings account in case you lose your job or, some unforeseen emergency happens. You can float for a little while until you get back on your feet. So with associations, naturally the risk is spread over more people, which is a good thing. Again, it's highly unlikely that everybody's going to go delinquent at the same time, but a case like COVID or some, really extreme, unusual scenario, a contingency line item, I would say coupled with a healthy line of credit is probably your best bet. Okay, let's see. Will this recording be posted on the SCCA website? I don't know, Roger, if you're still with us, if you want to chime in on that. I have no issue with this being posted on the website. That's totally fine with me.
Once you send us the link, once you send me the YouTube link, I'll have the webmaster put it up probably within 24 hours. So it'll
Perfect.
show up under past programs.
Sure. So we should, just to give you a timeline, after the class today, we do a little bit of video editing just to cut out, kind of the opening remarks there, but should have that to you, if not today, then over the weekend. So I would say by early next week, everybody should be able to hopefully get this through the website. And feel free to share this. We still have, I'm happy to see, I don't think we've really had many people drop off. We still have 47 people on the line. That's great. But feel free to circulate this around if you know people that couldn't make it today. If you've got a property manager that, might benefit from some of the information, this is for everybody's, for the public good, let's say. Yeah.
Just want to say one thing. I'm going to have to leave in about 2.5 minutes. But
no problem.
To all the members that are on this, they have some fantastic links to their programs on the Association Reserve website. There's a lot of past programs that they've put on, and now that you have a synopsis, it'd be to your advantage to go into there and pick up a couple of the links and see the full program on the specific items.
Yeah. Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, we've got a whole section on our website that's all educational content. So again, that's the address for that is reservestudy.com. So feel free to check that out. Roger, you can drop off the line whenever you need to. I'm gonna keep going as long as I still have open questions and people are still listening. So I think we'll go
I
another.
appreciate your time very much, Will, and
Yep.
thank you for putting this special presentation.
All right, you got it.
Okay, and I'll talk to you soon. Thank you, my friend.
Take care. Thanks.
Bye.
Okay, there's a question here. If there's an operating surplus at the end of the year, is it best to roll it over or transfer it to reserves? What criteria would determine the best course of action? It's a good question. I think that's maybe a case-by-case basis where you might look at your priorities. Obviously, if you are in a underfunded position with respect to reserves, if you've got some major projects coming up and you think that money could be useful there, then I think that's probably the best, that would be the first choice. Rolling it over to the following year, I'm not sure exactly how that would work, if there's any particular accounting requirements you need to disclose there. Great question for a CPA. Most of the time, 90+% of the time that we work with communities, they could certainly use more money in reserve. So I think that that's probably most of the time, almost all the time, the right thing to do. Every once in a while, we'll get a question of an association that feels that it's got a surplus, and they'll ask, hey, can we give this money back to our owners? I think that's almost never a good idea to give money back. If anything, maybe you can drop the budget a little bit for the next year if you're running a little high. Maybe you're able to find some savings there and reduce the budget. Maybe a better course of action, though, is just reinvest in the community. Is there some improvement you can make, or is there reserve money you can contribute? I think usually that's going to be your better choice. Maurice, good question here. If the reserves are 0% funded, why wouldn't the risk of a special assessment be 100%? Yeah, well, it certainly can be. So what's not really shown in that chart is the effect of time. So you can have an association that is a very new community, let's say 5 years old or less, that has no money in the bank, but they don't need an immediate special assessment because there's no immediate projects taking place. They have certain things that may happen at 10 years or 15 years down the road, but if they were to start now, they would have time on their side and could accumulate that money. If you have an older association where a lot of those expenses are happening in the very near future, then it's almost a 100% chance they're going to have a special assessment. So really, it's when we put together that chart, the outcome we were looking for was, do they need an immediate special assessment? Doesn't mean that it won't eventually be a certainty if they don't start taking better care of the community. So that's, if anything, that chart understates the risk. Certainly if you're in a weak position and you're not doing anything to get out of that position, it's pretty much inevitable that special assessments or loans are in your future. So good question there. Let's see, I'm going to clear some of these off the list. If you stop or reduce reserve contributions, does that require an owner vote? Yes, so again, just as a reminder, what the association is obligated to do, what the board is obligated to do every year, is to present a proposed budget to the owners that shows what it would take to fully fund the reserves. That is the legal obligation. Now, you can immediately follow that up by saying, hey, everybody, we're having a hard time with COVID this year. We're obligated to show you this fully funded amount, but we have a very, kind of tough situation on our hands. Or here's an alternate budget where we're going to underfund the reserves, or we're going to stop reserves this year. If everybody votes, we can approve this alternate budget, and that's what goes into effect. So kind of the default is that you have to show fully funding your reserves to the owners so they can make an informed decision. But if their informed decision is to stop or reduce reserve contributions, then they can vote to do that. So great question. Something you want to probably work with an attorney if that's something that you think you need to do. We're big proponents of putting together a professional team. Have a great CPA, have a great manager, have a great attorney. work with them, talk to them, get insights from their experience with other communities, and let them guide you in the right direction. But yeah, you first and foremost want to make sure you satisfy the legal obligation, which is to present fully funded reserves, but the owners can then vote to do less than that or to stop reserves. Okay, what is the formula for calculating percent funded? Yeah, great question, Diane. So, and again, this is part of the, the content that we cover in those other classes, but I'll talk you through it real quickly. So, the example I gave earlier where we were talking about the fully funded balance for an asset, a 10-year asset, $10,000 cost, 4 years into its life, you should have $4,000. Okay, so that number is what we call the fully funded balance, the number that you should have, theoretical number. We basically set up a fraction where we have that as the denominator, and we're going to put a numerator in, which is actual cash. So if at that point in time, the community only has $2,000 in the bank, you would take 2/4, and you would say that you're 50% funded. If they only had $1,000 in the bank, they would be 1/4, they'd be 25% funded. So when we do this sort of analysis for an entire community, again, we're looking at the individual line items that they're reserving for, calculating the fully funded balance, the theoretical need for each one, adding those together. That determines the size of how big the pool of funds should be. We then have something to compare actual cash against. So then we take a look at their cash on hand, divide it into the combined fully funded balance based on all the components. That tells us percent funded. So again, a lot more material on the website. We've got some specific examples of how to do that there, but that's the broad strokes. You have cash on hand divided by this fully funded balance, which is a number that's calculated based on the individual life and cost estimates for all your assets. Hope that was clear enough. If not, give me a call. We can talk that over. Can a surplus from a special assessment be transferred into reserves? That's a good question. Maybe a better question for an attorney. I think sometimes when you have a special assessment for a specific purpose, they say that money can only be used for that specific purpose. So if you had a special assessment for concrete restoration and painting, I'm not exactly sure if you can then use that money and contribute it towards your overall pooled reserve account, or if you have a straight line situation, if you can only use the excess for your next paint job, for example. So good question. I mean, if you have a special assessment and the project doesn't end up costing what you thought and you have some money left over, hopefully you can make use of that and put it into your reserves, or use it to pay off a big insurance bill or something like that. But I would say that if it were me, it should be allowable, but I just don't know. That's a good question to run by an attorney. Okay, what does a reserve study cost? Yeah, common question. So the short answer is that it depends on the size of the property, the location, the number of amenities, number of units, what time of year, as I talked about. Now is kind of a more expensive time of year for a reserve study just because we're backlogged. It really comes down to man hours. How long are we going to be on site doing our physical analysis? And then how long are we going to take to do all the research, put together all the cost estimates, and deliver the study? So just as a broad range, I always say, about 90% of the work we do falls between, let's say $3,000 and $4,000, maybe $5,000, if it's the first time a community has ever had a reserve study done. Once you've had the initial one done, future updates to that study are, maybe a half or 2/3 of that cost, if not less. So if you've never had one done, then the cost can be, a couple $1,000s, I would say on average. But our website has a feature there where you can request a proposal. So if you want to check that out, you can just click that link, and that'll walk you through the information we need to send one out. So usually we get the proposals out within a couple of days. It's a good question, Mike. Thank you. Okay, it's a great question, Jim. Is there a recommended target percentage for reserve accounts as a percentage of the total monthly assessment that boards should try to achieve as a minimum? Going to depend obviously on a case-by-case basis, but what we have seen, what I can tell you is that in the communities that are doing it well, that are in a strong financial position with respect to reserves, what we've typically found is that they contribute between 15 and 40% of their budget to reserves. Okay, so some of you may have heard of the 10% rule, which comes from FHA approval, which basically states that for a condo to be approved for FHA-backed loans, it has to be contributing at least 10% of its budget to reserves. That's a good starting point, but in reality, it usually takes more than that to properly fund. So for those out there, think of your individual situations. If you've got a $1 million annual operating budget, in our experience, something like $150,000 to $400,000 should be going to reserves. It certainly is a high number, but that's the reality of the situation. It's not an afterthought. It should be, if not the biggest line item in your total budget, definitely in the top 2 or 3. So you would need a more thorough analysis to figure that out. But just as a very rough back of the envelope calculation, what we found is between 15 and 40% of your total budget. That seems to be a generally healthy number. To put a finer point on that, you can say that communities that are newer and simpler, maybe with fewer amenities, fewer mechanical systems, can be at the lower end of that spectrum. If you've got a oceanfront property, couple of decade-old building, with lots of amenities and mechanical systems, then you're closer to that 40% number. And I know a lot of you probably live in those types of properties. I've driven up and down the Space Coast many times. As I look out off A1A and you just see the miles and miles of condos right in the front row seat, right on the beach, built in the 70s and 80s, those are the types of buildings that need to be contributing much more to reserves on average, especially if they haven't been doing a good job of that historically. Okay, we got 2 more, and wow, still have 42 people. I appreciate all you guys hanging in there. This is great. I've got 2 more questions here. This one's from Mike. How does inflation factor into the future costs, future funding? So when you do a long-term financial plan, you certainly should be factoring in some amount of inflation to predict future costs. In our case, where our default is usually 3%. So if I look at a project, I'm gonna price it out. If you had to do this project today, and how much is this going to be in the future? Well, we're going to model a 3% compound inflation to set that target, 5, 10, 15 years out, however long that is in the future. And that's the thing that we're aiming for. So when we design your contribution rate, we're looking at how much money you have in the bank today, how much you will need at the time that project actually gets done. And then we can design a cash flow model that says, okay, over the years, you need to be accelerating your reserve contributions to keep up with this inflation and meet that future target. And that's especially true when you have certain things that recur on a fairly regular basis. So something like painting usually should be done about every 7 years. So let's say you just had your building painted this year. 7 years from now, what we can do is use the cost you paid today plus 3% inflation compounded over 7 years. That's about what it's going to take to paint the building in the future. So now we're aiming at that future target. And 7 years after that, it's going to go up and up and up. Just as a quick aside, there's a rule in finance called the rule of 72, which is if you take the number 72 and you divide by some percentage, that, whether that's an interest rate, an inflation rate, that will tell you how often it takes money to double. Okay, so if you're investing money in the stock market, let's say, and you were able to get a 10% average annual return, that would mean you take 72 divided by 10. That means your money should double about every 7.2 years. So if you use a 3% annual inflation rate on a cost of a project, 72 divided by 3 is 24. So that means that a project today will double in cost about every 24 years. And so that's a very, very significant increase and something you want to be modeling. And if you question those numbers, just look backwards, right? Think about 24 years ago what things cost. If you bought a condo in your building 20 something years ago, how much less would you have paid for it then? Well, that's the result of inflation. Most everything goes up a little bit every year. And so we definitely need to take that into account. Okay, last question here. As a nonprofit, is there a limit to what we can carry over to the reserves? That's an interesting one. That seems like it's maybe more of a tax question. To me, there's not any limitations that I'm aware of as to how much money you put into reserves. Associations usually file rather a different tax form. I think it's 1120H, which means that there's really not any profit or taxable income assigned to reserve contributions. So, if you collect $10,000 this year in reserves and you only spend $5,000, there's not a taxable event there. There's no limit as to carrying over that other $5,000 to the next year. That's seen as just an investment in the property. So again, not maybe the most sophisticated answer, a good one for your CPA, but as far as I'm aware, we don't have any other limitations about carrying money from year to year in reserves. So, okay, folks, that is the last one on the list. So I guess we will probably wrap it up for now. It's about 12:30. Just want to thank everybody again for joining us today. As I said, we'll have a recording of the session, including this Q&A that I'll prepare and we'll send out in the next couple of days. So nice to see you. Thanks, Jackie. Appreciate that. And certainly if you have any other questions, again, I'll just give you out my email address. That's wsimons, WSIMONS, @reservestudy.com. And reservestudy.com, our website, great resource for you there. You can request proposals. You can get all sorts of information. So I'll leave it at that for now. Wish everybody a happy weekend and a COVID-free rest of the year. So thanks, everybody, and we'll talk to you again soon. Take care.